Welcome to today's webinar, which we are admittedly starting a few minutes late, called Teaming Up for Urban Forestry, New Tools to Build and Energize Local Sustainability Efforts, hosted by the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network. It is partially funded by the U.S. EPA's Office of Sustainable Communities and is managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars like today's Teaming Up for Urban Forestry, New Tools to Build and Energize Local Sustainability Efforts, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, your one-stop on the web for the most current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. We provide timely news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series produced by the Clearinghouse that are available to view at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and we'll post a link to it on our website later this week. We encourage you to visit smartgrowth.org and subscribe to our weekly e-newsletter to get the latest nationwide information about planning and smart growth and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about other planning activities and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To log your CM credits, log into your account on APA's website and search the name of today's event, Teaming Up for Urban Forestry, New Tools to Build and Energize Local Sustainability Efforts, or event number 914-5080. This webinar has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. So today we're excited to present Teaming Up for Urban Forestry, New Tools to Build and Energize Local Sustainability Efforts. In today's webinar, we will discuss the resources available to help policymakers and municipal executives make decisions about the future of their community's forests, and to learn how urban forestry can help drive progress towards smart growth and sustainability goals. Today, we are joined by 3 experts in urban forestry, Larry Wiseman, Ian Leahy, and Lauren Marshall. Lauren Marshall is the National Program Manager for Urban and Community Forestry with the U.S. Forest Service. In this position and as a professional landscape architect, she helps people weave natural infrastructure into the fabric of their communities, connecting them to the natural world, from the trees that shade their sidewalks to the national forest that provides their drinking water. Larry Wiseman formed CenterLine Strategy after a 29-year career as the founding president and CEO of the American Forest Foundation. In 2010, he received the Legacy Award from the Arbor Day Foundation for Career Achievement in Forestry. That same year, he began a consulting practice providing strategy and organizational development services to government agencies, companies, nonprofits, and foundations on matters related to the environment, natural resources, and sustainability. Ian Leahy has been the Director of Urban Forest Programs at American Forest since 2014. To the award-winning Community Relief Initiative, he has developed and implemented a theory of change model that helps cities expand their long-term capacity to manage urban forests. Following the presentations, our panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You may submit a question anytime during the webinar by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. Now I'll turn it over to Lauren to get us started. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Michael. Can you all hear us?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. As Michael said, my name is Lauren Marshall, and I'm a National Program Manager for Urban and Community Forestry with the U.S. Forest Service and a landscape architect. So talking to planners and other sustainability professionals always feels a little bit like coming home. I am particularly excited to talk to you today about a project that we've been working on for probably 3.5 years now that's really near and dear to my heart, and that's the Vibrant Cities Lab. You can find it at vibrantcitieslab.com. And really, it is exactly what it says in this slide. We recognize that people want to live, work, and learn near trees, and the Vibrant Cities Lab provides the free tools to make it happen. So I will stress here, we often get questions about whether or not this is a free tool, and the answer is yes. Everything you're going to see on here is absolutely free. So first, a little bit about how we got to where we are with the Vibrant Cities Lab. There are 3 main partners who came together to build this tool. The U.S. Forest Service has a group called the Technology and Science Delivery Team that recognized that we really were failing to provide a one-stop shop of curated, best available science and tools for urban forestry professionals and our allied professions. And in doing so, we were making it much more difficult for our customers and for the American public to really understand what science and what practices were going to help their urban forests thrive. We approached American Forests about working with us to build out a tool that would have the latest research and best practices for urban forests and urban forestry professionals. And when I say urban forestry professionals, I mean that very broadly, basically anyone who cares about the trees outside their front doors. At the same time, we were working with the National Association of Regional Councils, and more specifically, Larry Wiseman was heading up that project, to build out a second website that was a step-by-step guide and self-assessment tool for how communities could build sustainable urban forestry programs. And that website is going to be based on years of research and best science. And the further we got along in these 2 projects, the more we really realized that they needed to be one project. And so Ian, Larry, and I sat down in a room, much like we are today, and looked at each other and said, doesn't this just make more sense? And thankfully, everybody agreed. And we spent the next 2 years working together to pull together the Vibrant Cities Lab. So on there now, you'll find a curated section of the latest research. So not just the latest thing to come out, but what we really believe is the state of the science. And there are experts in the U.S. Forest Service and in American Forests who are helping to review the science as it comes out to determine what we think is the best available. You'll find best practices from communities of all sizes. That includes policies and ordinances and plans. So if you're wondering what a community around your size, with perhaps your similar demographics or climate type has been doing, you can very well find that on Vibrant Cities Lab. It also has a self-assessment tool for your community's needs and goals, and we'll talk a bit about that, and a step-by-step guide for how to build out your own urban forestry program. And of course, hundreds of resources, as I mentioned. And that continues to grow. Well, we will be taking things off the site if they become out of date. For example, if new research supersedes old research, we would remove that old research. We do anticipate more and more resources on the site as time goes on. Just a little bit about what our friends are saying about Vibrant Cities Lab. A fabulous free resource for anyone involved in issues related to sustainable cities, and a one-stop shop of vetted professional information and tools. So if you, those are sort of the nice taglines from our friends as to what you can expect from Vibrant Cities Lab. And finally, we really took a lot of time in the design and development of this site to create something that we thought was incredibly user-friendly and had a platform that was easy to navigate. And so you'll see this is when you first go to vibrantcitieslab.com, if any of you have it pulled up on your laptops right now, this is what you see. And there really aren't a lot of options for what you can click, but what we're going to do over the next few minutes is go through a number of scenarios that show you how you might be able to use these different sections and how they all fit together. So by the time we finish this webinar, you should have a pretty clear understanding of how you can use the Vibrant Cities Lab to further your work. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Ian Leahy.
Hello. So Ian Leahy with American Forests. So this first scenario, you're responsible for reaching a wide array of sustainability goals. You implicitly know trees can contribute to a number of them, but there's a lot of competing interests with limited funding. So how do you build a diverse coalition that can actually make that happen? The Make the Case section of this site is designed to do that. It provides you tools in one place to speak directly to the specific interests of diverse audiences, some of whom may never think about trees as anything more than background actors in their lives, and others who may have the resources to really fundamentally impact the tree canopy of your city, but maybe are not focused in that direction at the moment. So people using this section of the site for such purposes as advocating their city council, generating buy-in from agencies and allied disciplines, or responding to frequently asked questions from their constituents. City foresters have told us they keep a tab open on their computer all day so they can pull up an answer quickly if a resident might, for example, not want a tree in front of our house. There are currently 11 areas of impact we highlight, with a 12th, resilience, being developed. That'll go in that bottom right box, and we'll talk more about that later. We worked with an advisory group of experts and scientists to determine the best way to categorize the increasingly expansive body of research on trees' economic, environmental, social, and psychological impacts. And these were the categories that really popped out and overlapped with, where decision makers are really looking for impact. Each impact area has a synopsis of the connection between trees and that topic. So if you see nothing else, you can just take a quick little snapshot and get that information and move on quickly. You can see on the left side of the screen here, every asset on this site can be saved or shared directly from the page. And we have, you'll see iconography throughout. We tried to make this site easy to navigate. There's a lot of information throughout the internet. It's not always easy to find, so we really focus on user experience and create visual cues and color coding that would help people know where they are on the site and know where they want to get to. So each impact area has a combination of snapshot case studies and research syntheses. The case studies in particular will be regularly updated. We work to find a mix of efforts in diverse communities facing different issues: suburbs, big cities, small towns, isolated mid-sized cities. We really try to embrace wherever people live. We don't want the name Vibrant Cities Lab to be confusing. It's really a community-driven scope. And there's a lot of case studies out there in the world. So we tried to avoid highlighting the $30 million park that most cities probably won't be able to build just for its own sake. Instead, we really honed in on what urban forestry brings to the table and created case studies that fall into two general categories. One is programmatic or bureaucratic efforts that can be replicated elsewhere. And where we did feature transformative projects, we chose ones that had unexpected impacts, such as here you can see Philadelphia's use of green infrastructure to control stormwater, also reduced crime, or Youngstown's transformation of vacant lots into active green spaces dramatically reduced violence in their community. And I want to highlight the word snapshot here. These are not expansive academic analyses. The whole idea of this site is to get you quick information in as few words as possible, and then give you access to deeper information where you can go to the original source and dive deeper and connect to the individuals who are actually responsible for it. For the research syntheses, we had a panel of scientists work with us to make sure we captured the most up-to-date understanding that research has uncovered about tree canopy in the built environment. There's a lot of research-based anecdotes about tree impacts throughout the internet, but quality of research behind such factoids is not always consistent and is regularly changing. So we focus on synthesizing the most rigorous studies, or those bodies where there's just enough research from different perspectives that really comes to a clear conclusion. And I want to be clear, this is not a propaganda site. We wanted this site to be somewhere that, for example, a police chief who'd prefer to remove trees to improve sight lines can come to as a trusted source and see what the research actually says in that regard. While most research does show positive impacts of tree canopy, we included both the positive and negative conclusions so people could make informed decisions and calculate risk. I actually wore a Department of Transportation jacket here today inadvertently. I used to work emergency response in the middle of the night, getting trees off cars and houses, so I'm well aware firsthand of the risk they bring, but it just reinforces the need for the right tree in the right place and a really proactive management strategy that minimizes those risks as best as possible. Public health is probably the most dynamic discipline right now, where tree canopy is being used to help address broad issues that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily connect. For example, a recent 8-year study out of Harvard found women living near nature had a 12% lower mortality rate. Other research has found students do better academically when they have views of nature, stress levels are lower. The impacts go on and on. The psychological and physical impacts are a real selling point for people who might shrug at stormwater management or climate objectives that maybe we would find more interesting. And that's the whole point of this site, is really finding the argument that works for the audience you're trying to reach and funneling that particular information to that audience. And you can see there are projects across the country demonstrating how campuses, waterfronts, and neighborhoods are being reimagined to address mental and physical health issues. There are also 35 additional curated resources linked through Vibrant Cities Lab that lets you dive deeper specifically on the topic of human health. For example, this Urban Nature for Human Health and Well-Being is a new publication that the Forest Service just released this year. And it does a deep dive on all the research related to health impacts. So I will now hand it over to Larry Wiseman, and he'll go into the next scenario and cover the Vibrant Cities Lab Resource Library.
Hi, by way of introduction, let me explain for a moment how I migrated in 2010 from rural forestry to urban forestry. It began in the 90s, actually, and our organization, the one that I founded, was trying to put together a conservation strategy for private forest lands. And we did some research and we found that the biggest impediment to stewardship on private lands wasn't clear cutting or bad forest management, it was development. So we convened a conference, and this was in the early 90s, mid-90s, on sprawl, because we recognized at that point that we were losing about a million and a half acres a year of privately owned forest land to development. We surmised that this had a health impact, and we were the first organization to give Richard Jackson, who's now Dean of the School of Public Health at UCLA, a platform. At the time, he was head of environmental health at the Centers for Disease Control, and he made a very explicit case against sprawl because as a public health hazard. Well, over the years, that translated in my mind to the relationship between trees and people. Trees where people live are absolutely vital to an enormous number of sustainability challenges, as Ian suggested. The evidence is here, it's on the site. I think it's convincing, but how do you bring together all the stakeholders that are necessary to make it happen? That's why we put together this toolkit that Lauren mentioned earlier on. It'll walk you through roughly 6 phases and 17 steps. I want to point out, for those of you who are affiliated with the American Planning Association, you'll find that the planning framework we use is very much drawn from the framework that APA put together in their research publications and practice publications on urban forestry. Goes through 6 phases. Assessment, of course, is absolutely critical at the front end, and then at the back end, sustaining the program, anticipating and managing risks to the urban forest, all of that is covered. I want to spend a minute talking about tree centricity. A lot of people will look at this site and assume that it's all about trees, but it's much more than that. It's really about sustainability and multiple goals and the use of trees, the strategic use of trees in ways that benefit many different constituencies. I'm sure all of us have heard of or even witnessed or participated in a big goal tree planting campaign, a million tree campaign. Those are great, but I think if you examine it, you'll find, and if you walk through the site, I think you'll conclude, as we did, is that simply setting an ambitious goal for tree planting, the stable 1 million trees, does not an effective program make. You really need to know where the trees are, where you don't have them, and why you need them, and then you have to set a goal. But the goal isn't defined solely in trees. It's defined in terms of the benefits you seek for your residents. So let's go back to our challenge of creating a program and sort of assembling the coalition that's necessary to both create and sustain that program. This is a chart from the site that looks at getting other municipal agencies to buy in. It's not easy. In prep for this, developing this site, we did survey work among urban foresters, stormwater managers, and city officials. And in those surveys, we discovered that aligning municipal departments was one of the biggest challenges to creating an effective urban forestry campaign. You'll note the list isn't complete. As we go forward, we're going to be making additions to this list on a quarterly basis as we review the resources. Missing is criminal justice system, social services administration, social workers, hospitals, schools. Schools are on here, but all of those disciplines have an interest in the impacts of trees on their specific constituencies. Ian mentioned the effect of trees on student performance, green space and trees. It also has a positive impact, according to researchers here in DC itself, on attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity disorder, and many communities are beginning to prescribe walks in the forest for their younger patients. Along with building municipal departments, an alliance among them, experience suggests, and we kind of collected this experience from 30 to 40 cities that have built exemplary urban forest programs. It needs an anchor institution. An anchor institution is an institution that has a strong mission connection to the benefits of urban forestry, has trust from the community, and funds and staff to hang in and do the job over the long haul. This is not something that can be done in a few months or even a few years. It's a long-term commitment. Increasingly, hospitals, as Ian mentioned, are taking an increasing role in promoting community health. Part of that has to do with access and delivery, but a significant part has to do with creating healthy places where people live. Respiratory disease and cardiovascular disease is measurably lower where trees are present. So here are the remaining 10 steps. You'll note as you go through the list that there's a fairly strong emphasis on private lands. The reason is simple, and I'm sure most of you know this. Virtually every community we examined in our research phase finds the bulk of their tree canopy on land that's controlled by private homeowners and businesses. These properties aren't managed by the municipality or the county itself. So the community needs to develop a broad menu of strategies, from ordinances and regulations to zoning rules, to including incentives, the most dramatic or the most common of which is a stormwater utility fee, which can be reduced to the extent that private landowners undertake efforts to reduce stormwater through green infrastructure. The idea is pretty simple: to promote more trees and better care on private lands. Two digressions here. One relates to what Ian was talking about, the benefits of trees. A lot of the public needs to know, and many of them want to know, the value the trees bring to their household in terms of energy cost savings, to their community in terms of cleaner air. And this site is designed to provide tools to help you do that. There's a suite of web accessible tools that will help you demonstrate what trees can do for a neighborhood, what it can do for an individual house lot, what it can do for a community as a whole. The suite is called iTree. You can access it directly through the toolkit. You'll see various places as you go through it, an iTree logo, and of the three tools, landscape, the one that looks at a total community or a neighborhood or a census block or what have you, may be the most valuable. I encourage you to do that. The second digression is about sustainability. I'm sure many of you work in areas where there is a lot of concrete infrastructure, a lot of hard infrastructure, street, sewer systems, and so forth. You're not surprised that these require ongoing maintenance and deliberate risk management. Well, trees do too. There's a section on risk management in the site. A significant piece of it is devoted to ways that you can monitor and maintain your trees at cost effectively. There's also a considerable attention paid to pests and disease. You know, people tend to look at a tree and it sort of sits there on their yard or it sits there in the street for years. It's a little hard to remember that it's a dynamic ecosystem. They're living things. They grow old. Like me, they get a little bit senescent. You saw my picture. I'm the oldest one. And then they die. Well, this can be accelerated, exacerbated, whatever you want to call it, through the introduction of invasive pests. There's one you may have heard of that's flying through at least 25 states. It's called the emerald ash borer. The Forest Service estimates that it could cost municipalities more than $10 billion in the next day and destroy as many as 20% of the trees in some municipalities. That is a challenge to community sustainability on a number of dimensions, not just tree canopy, but health, energy conservation, climate change, what have you. Okay. We currently catalog about 500 resources in our library. We're going to review it quarterly to make sure we have the most up-to-date, credible resources for your use. For anybody's use, need to emphasize that at this point that you can download your resources that you're interested in directly to your own Vibrant Cities Lab user library. You can barely see it on the screen, but if you look after the, if you click on each of these boxes, you'll see an arrow in a box that will take you to the resource itself, which is accessible most of the time in hard copy, sometimes in abstract. What I've done here is list some of the 21 different strategies and models we use for private spaces and private lands, tree canopy initiatives.
Okay, so this third scenario is based on the idea you've built your coalition. You're able to begin addressing a number of items on your sustainability to-do list. But now you're starting to get asked those really specific questions not about the broad benefits and impacts, but about your location. So how do you know where your particular city stands and what comes next? We built this community assessment and goal setting tool to do just that. It's based on extensive academic analysis from Clark Matheny, who laid out 28 criteria required to really have a robust, healthy urban forestry program across public and private sector, as well as nonprofit within any community. So it's pretty simple to use it. We're very conscious in developing this assessment tool to not create a situation where someone's trying to gauge where their city is at and create something public or something that a mayor or city manager or just their own supervisor might judge their performance and say, you're not keeping up, it's time to try someone else. We really want this to help the people who are currently in the trenches doing the work. So this tool is self-contained, no one tracks it or makes it public if you don't want it to be, but you're able to share on your own, obviously. And the basic idea is that for each urban forestry criteria, you make a judgment on where your city currently is, and then set a realistic goal for it based on your own objectives, capacities as a city, and where you think you can realistically get to. This way you aren't being held to an arbitrary standard that you could never reach. You can really choose your own adventure on this one. So for example, if you don't have an urban tree canopy assessment done at all, you get -1 point. It's not only not helping you, it's actively working against your goal. If you've used the free software, such as the scientifically vetted iTree tools that Larry mentioned, to do a citywide random point-based assessment, that is good. Give yourself 2 points. If your city has invested in a high-level LiDAR imagery or satellite analysis, perhaps partnering with a university or a consultant, give yourself 3 points. And if you did all that and you're actually using it and it's not just sitting on a shelf, congratulations, you get 4 points. Yeah. So some of the criteria are technical arboricultural objectives, really specific, but others are more focused on broad coalition building and other social factors. If anyone's studied natural resource management, you know that those are, both sides of that are critical to actually finding success. So in this example on your screen, you assess how well different city agencies are working with each other. If they're incredibly siloed, -1 point. Again, that's in ways doing more damage than just neutral. If a city forester is engaged to address critical issues as they arise, 1 point. There's at least some sort of conversation going on. If there are informal groups collaborating on a project basis or need basis, then 2 points. That's moving in the right direction. And if there's formal policy and agencies are working together in formal groups to achieve very clear objectives, then that's the ideal for that particular one, and you get 4 points. So you go through all 28 criteria like this, and it gives you your current total, your goal total, and then the gap score. And you can take this over and over again as many times as you want and track your own progress as you hopefully are closing that gap. And it can also be used as an advocacy tool so that, a nonprofit, for example, or a citizen can take this. It's all free and accessible, and get a better idea of where their city is, and help encourage their city to move in a better direction in terms of urban forest management. Yeah.
This is Larry again. It's also being used as a coalition building tool by a couple of communities where they're bringing different heads or senior staff from different municipal departments together and having them go through the assessment together. This turns out to be a very, very good tool for collaborative learning, which is really the cornerstone of coalition building. So I encourage you to look at this not just as an assessment tool, but also an educational tool. It's actually being used in some university classes as well. and it can work with just about any department or discipline that you think might benefit from being part of your coalition.
And this is Lauren. I just want to stress a big concern we heard in the development of this particular scoring tool, this assessment tool, was that folks did not want to feel like they had to be compared against other communities. And so I really want to stress that this is only as public as you want it to be. If you create a login on the site, you can save it. Other folks can't search for that. They can't find it. It's just for you. If you want to use it in a way that Larry just described as a public-facing tool to help build coalitions and as sort of a process tool, you're welcome to do that as well. If you want to post it on your city's website, you're welcome to do that. But there's nobody's collecting these scores. Nobody's grading you on these scores. It's really just meant as a tool to help you understand where you are and where you want to be.
And this is where the account or how you save it. You can either create a new account if you already have an iTree Tools account. That's at itreetools.org. You can log in with that. It's all integrated. And yeah, so you can save your assessment history and track your progress towards closing that gap goal. You can save any content in the site. All of the research links directly to the original or as close to the original as we could get until we hit a paywall. You can save that content to the account too.
Great. So this is Lauren. I'm going to sort of take us home, so to speak, on this by talking a little bit about what's coming next with the Vibrant Cities Lab, and then opening it up for questions. So we're really looking forward to having some discussion with you all. First of all, we are working with the Baltimore Field Station to build out an urban wood book. The Field Station is publishing an urban wood book that we're then going to be taking and turning into an interactive implementation guide that tells communities how they can build out vibrant urban wood economies. Urban wood economies can consist of the wood coming out of decommissioned homes, but that is very relevant in somewhere like Baltimore, where I believe there are 40,000 vacant row homes. But it is not maybe as relevant to a city that doesn't have that type of vacancy issue. Certainly every community is going to have some wood coming out of decommissioned homes, but in a lot of places, the larger supply of wood is the wood that's coming out of urban forestry activities. You can see here in Baltimore alone, there are 200,000 trees at risk from the emerald ash borer. What's going to happen with that wood? Can it be used, and what are the components of an economy that allow it to be used in a eco-friendly way? There's quite a big job component there, jobs that are local to your community. The folks who process and sell this wood are local folks, and it's a pretty powerful story coming out of Baltimore that we're really excited to share with others so they can adapt it in their communities. This says 4 project components. They actually just updated the Baltimore Wood Project website. If you Google it, you'll go to it. There are now 8 project components, and we're excited to bring that into the Vibrant Cities Lab so that folks can start to think about what that means for their communities and how they can build it out. And Ian mentioned earlier that there is another section coming. There are 11 sections right now, and that conspicuous blank box at the end, we are talking about building that into a resilience section so that communities can look at how trees impact their resilience, both in terms of things like treating stormwater, but also in terms of after a major storm, before and after a major storm, what can you do to make sure that your urban canopy is cared for? And so our northeastern area is coming out with a updated version of the Storms Over the Urban Forest Toolkit that talks about just that. We're going to be building that into an interactive implementation guide that will be available, or most likely building it into that will be available in this resilience section to help communities before disaster prepare, and after disaster make sure that they're doing things like documenting tree damage on public lands in a way that qualifies them for FEMA reimbursement for those activities. Or little things like cutting damaged wood into 8-foot lengths so that it can be used in an urban wood economy. So things like that to think about in the resilience section. Another project that Larry's been really heavily involved in is the treesandStormwater.org site. And this is going to be linked to from Vibrant Cities as sort of a deeper dive into how you can use trees as a solution for treating stormwater. And that, hot off the presses, we're also looking into having that use the same login as Vibrant Cities and iTree so that folks will be able to log in with that same login for all of these. Larry, did you want to add anything about this site?
Well, yeah, a little bit. The nub of this site is enabling project managers, stormwater managers, policymakers to calculate long-term the impact of trees and vegetation on their stormwater management goals. Only recently have models been developed that adapt the current standard indicators. WinSlam is the EPA calculator. There are a number of other calculators. Only recently have they been adapted to take into account vegetation. So we spend a pretty good bit of time on this site speaking directly to engineers. But since stormwater management really involves multiple departments, the public works executives face the same kind of challenge that everybody else faces when they try to build out an effective tree canopy centric sustainability program.
And much like other aspects of the site, the way this links into Vibrant Cities Lab is we view this as a deep dive into a very specific topic. So it's part of the stormwater section. And we're getting some questions about where the community assessment tool is. So it's in two places, and we're actually going to be making it more visible because we've gotten that question numerous times. If you go to the toolkit homepage, go up to the navigation bar at the top, the toolkit, and just scroll down. You'll see a link to it in a box. And then another place you can get it is it's step 17 in the toolkit process. So go to the end of it and you'll just click on 17 and it'll take you into the assessment tool.
Great. One last thing we'll address quickly before we close it out and see if we have any questions. We really just wanted to point out how Vibrant Cities supports some of the global goals for sustainable development developed by the United Nations. And so we put check marks in the boxes that we think this addresses, but actually I would argue it addresses even more. For example, if you look at number 12, responsible consumption and production, you could certainly argue that urban wood is a part of responsible consumption and production. I think the statistic is it 18% of municipal waste is urban wood, or was at the turn of the century. So learning how to use that wood is certainly consumption or responsible consumption and production. But trees really support all of these things that you're seeing checked here. Good health and well-being, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, life below water. And that's why we built out Vibrant Cities. We believe that trees are a key part of the solution for a sustainable future, and we want to make it easy for folks who also believe that to make the case, or for folks who don't know it yet to sort of fall in love with trees as part of that solution.
And I'll throw in a little factoid on that. A lot of people don't know that more wood comes out of our cities than our national forests. And so
with that, our contact information is on this last slide for each of us, and we're more than happy to chat with you about anything related to this site. If you have suggested resources, you can actually send those to, I believe, our urban inbox, which is urban@fs.fed.us. And we have a process in place, or a process up and coming with experts who will review any suggested content and decide what is going to be put up on the site. And we're in the process of making that a very transparent process so folks can be aware of what's happening. With that, I'll hand it back to Michael to facilitate any questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Lauren, Larry, and Ian for this great presentation today. We have been receiving questions throughout the presentation, and those who want to continue to submit, if you want to go ahead and use the questions tool, we'll be able to take a look at those as well. So I actually have a few questions of my own based on this presentation. And I guess I'll start with a really basic one. Given that it's about urban forestry, why did you choose not to include that in the website name?
That's a good question. So it took us a long time to figure out what to call this. And part of it was specifically because we wanted this site to speak to non-tree people. And in our experience, the minute you create a cutesy tree pun name with a green website, a lot of people just shut down and say, oh, that's not me. So the name Vibrant Cities actually comes from our field about 7, 8 years ago now. We had a coalition of the best and brightest come together for this Vibrant Cities forum, and really laying out the future of where our field was going and the major issues it had to address. So we figured if we came up with some new name, it would always be attached to one organization or another, and we really wanted this to be embraced broadly as kind of a general tool. So we chose to reactivate the name Vibrant Cities and then add the name Lab on the end to indicate the interactive components of it.
Excellent. So as people are working through the website themselves, whether they're doing the assessment or looking at the different resources, is there a way for them to connect through you to other kind of types of technical assistance or programming?
Well, we do cite a number of resources in the resource library, and they're reflected in both the case studies and the research side as well as the practice side. Resources, organizations that can provide assistance. We do. We recognize that linking urban trees to sustainability goals is a long path with a lot of twists and turns, and we try to put guideposts up at many different places during that journey. Resources that are available to virtually everybody include the state urban forestry coordinators who can provide a door into technical resources in their state, the regional urban forestry coordinators from the Forest Service who actually are directly involved in a lot of the research and practice work that you see here, as well as other organizations that can play a role in species selection or soil characteristics, all the other things that connect you to, or connect trees to sustainability. We also talk a little bit about some of the hospital systems and what they're doing. And they do participate in a consortium where information is shared. So frankly, this site can be a gateway for many different disciplines, which understand the importance of green infrastructure, trees, to their specific mission and objectives.
And this is Lauren. I'll just mention, building on what Larry said. So this work was funded in part by the Urban and Community Forestry Program at the U.S. Forest Service, which is the program for which I'm a program manager. If you Google Urban and Community Forestry Program, it'll take you to our national website. That's the first result that comes up. And on that website, at the very bottom of the page, is a link to your regional coordinators with their contact information. So you can reach out to your U.S. Forest Service regional coordinators, who are always happy to make connections for you and help you find the resources you need. And then, of course, there is also a link to your state coordinators and the contact information for them. So every state, in order to receive funding through our program, has to have a state urban and community forestry coordinator in place. And they are an amazing, amazing resource when it comes to figuring out what's going on in your community, what's available, what's worked for others, and what hasn't. And so we encourage you to take advantage of that resource.
Great, thanks, Lauren. So the questions are coming in fast and furious now that we're going. So let me go ahead and read one of them for you. This one starts, our little city has a great urban forest, but it seems that city leaders have become complacent. Can you give us some suggestions to how to keep elected officials engaged in not only the establishment of an urban forest, but defending it against infill and road widening within the city?
So I guess my first response to that would be to figure out what does really matter to your city council. What is the issue that really moves them? Is it around transportation? Is it around education? Is it around crime? And that's exactly why we've organized Vibrant Cities the way that we have, so that you can figure out what matters to the people you're talking to and sell trees as a part of the solution to that problem. So that would be one thing. The other, I think, would be to look at some of the things that other communities are doing that are available, especially through the resource library. If you look for policies that other communities have in place, for example, tree ordinances, development policies. For example, there are some great examples of policies for developers on the site. It's a great way to spark a feeling of competition in cities to really strive to be the best. And so that's what I would mention, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues if they have other things.
Yeah, so at American Forest, we work with cities across the country and in building their urban forestry programs and overcoming those exact types of challenges. And one of the most successful tools we found is really finding a champion as a city council or, you know, ideally like a mayor or whoever has an authority figure, really tap into what they're interested in and turn them into champions for the urban forest. And then they're going to be sitting in these council meetings, and we've seen it happen over and over again. They start getting money unlocked. They start convincing their colleagues. So you don't have to take on the entire city leadership all at once. Just really try to figure out where you can find a champion.
Great.
Okay. Did anybody want to add to that?
Nope, I think we're good.
Okay. So we got a couple questions about asking where on the website that the tree forest uptake of greenhouse gases and mitigating climate change is addressed.
Air quality.
Yeah, that's in the air quality section.
Okay.
And you'll likely see more of that in the upcoming resilience section as well.
Yeah.
Okay. How can a jurisdiction submit a case study that they think would be useful or relevant to urban forestry?
So the best way to do that is likely on the website. Actually, there's a contact for this. So in case I get it wrong, you can find it, I believe, at the bottom of the webpage in the contact us link. But it's urban@fs.fed.us is our urban inbox, and we've got folks monitoring that. What'll happen is you can submit the case study, and then it'll go into the queue of resources to be reviewed. It'll be reviewed by the sort of expert team that is going to be doing that. But the case study, because that's sort of a living thing, if they have questions, I'm sure they would reach out for minor edits, and then it would be loaded onto the site.
Great. Okay, here's another content-related question. In the research section of the site, how can users distinguish between peer-reviewed journal articles and articles that have not been peer-reviewed?
So the research is based on peer-reviewed. Don't think, was there any that missed?
If you go to the landing page for each resource, there's where it was published is noted. Most folks will recognize peer-reviewed publications. Where we're dealing with case studies and best practices, that's really reviewed by the expert team that's putting the site together, not by an independent panel as with an academic journal. I think it's pretty clear when you look at a resource, it'd be pretty clear whether it's from a peer-reviewed site or not. In fact, there are a number of resources which are only accessible through paywalls, and what we do is we link to the abstract and leave it up to the user whether or not to subscribe to that particular publication.
And wherever possible, we are trying to get as close to the primary source as possible.
Great. Okay. Do your case studies include examples of jurisdictions that have done the community assessment toolkit?
Not yet.
Not yet. That's a great question, and one that we hope to have included in the next year. We know there are states where their state coordinators are interested in using this as a part of their outreach and community, sort of building their community capacity. And so we're hopeful. The site only launched this past November. That was our hard launch of the Partners in Community Forestry Conference in Tulsa. So we really haven't had anyone, I think, a lot of people have done the assessment. I don't think it's been quite enough time for anyone to have used it to make substantive change. But we would love to have that up in the next year or two, and that's a great suggestion.
Okay. One of the questioners sent something, if you could kind of expand to talk a little bit more about how neighborhoods and community organizations can best use the resources on the site.
Well, having used it myself with a community organization where I serve on the board, I can speak from personal experience. If your mission is nature-based, you can use this site to enrich your case for donations, for political leverage, what have you. There are a number of potent arguments in favor of supporting nature, many of which reach far beyond aesthetics, property values, including public health, energy conservation, climate change, educational performance, school performance. And those are potent arguments that can drive a coalition and drive success for their mission. The organization that I'm on the board of is the Audubon Naturalist Society. It was founded 40 years before the National Audubon Society in the 19th century, and there are 13 of them around the East Coast. And we have been successful in our capital campaign and in our political work because we've actually gone into the lab and pulled out very potent, scientifically backed arguments for the kind of action we want this county council to take.
We started piloting this with a small community, a suburban city, who was in a unique situation where they were, they had a punitive approach. Their urban forestry is really focused on just enforcing violations of ordinance, and they were interested in transitioning to a more holistic approach. So if you find an opportunity like that they're making new hires, so it's really an opportunity to go in and rethink their entire approach to managing the tree canopy on public and private land, and be more proactive rather than just responsive to violations.
Excellent. Okay, so we have a few specific questions based on what you presented. So I think one that, of our participants quoted, I think from your presentation, it said, more wood comes out of our cities than our national forests. As someone who lives in the Pacific Northwest and sees evidence of lots of logging in our national forests, this seems impossible. Where does this statistic come from?
You just add it up. They keep very good records of what's harvested from federal lands, and Ian's group has a pretty good tally of wood that is waste. What's currently considered waste wood is generated from urban.
I remember that's not consistent across. So yeah, the Pacific Northwest has higher logging focus. This is a nationwide stat. So
okay, so there would be some regional variation then.
Yes. Definitely. But there are about 136 million acres of urban forest right now, and 190 million acres of national forest. So they're comparable, obviously not identical, but they're in the same range of acreage.
And if you shoot us an email, we can get you that statistic that Ian's citing. Be happy to send it your way.
Okay, so the person who sent the question, if you want to send us an email, we'll pass that along. Okay, to move on then. Can you discuss the challenge of addressing commercial property owners that resist the planting of trees that would block signage and visibility of commercial frontage?
So the best argument for that is in the economic development section. It really goes through, and we run into this all the time. There's research out there that shows people spend more on retail on tree-lined streets. They spend longer time there. They spend more on retail for the same type of product, not necessarily upgrading to another level of luxury. Property values increase on tree-lined streets, so you can make a very, very strong economic argument for the presence of tree canopy as an asset for businesses.
One of the resources that we include was a study with case studies by the Urban Land Institute, which is kind of the trade group and research group for developers. And here you have developers themselves and business people themselves making a very strong case for adding green infrastructure to their landscape plans. In part, that's because often they'll get incentives to do so through the local stormwater utility. So it's not a cost sink, it can be a cost saver. And second, because as Ian suggested, whether it's an institutional campus, a corporate campus, or just an office building, having trees and other green space on the site will improve productivity, add value to the property. All of these studies are cited in this report from the Urban Land Institute. And it's pretty credible because these are the folks that do the developing around the country.
Okay, so there's a question actually related to utilities. Have utilities been involved in the development of the site, or do your case studies address the need to work with utilities on their trimming of trees and management of their utility right-of-way?
Yes, short answer, yes. Utilities obviously play a role because they occupy the same space as urban trees, whether it's the soil available for trees could be, as it is in DC, many places, shot through with 150-year-old sewer lines, or electric wire, telecom wire overhead. The utilities need to be well integrated into any kind of urban forestry plan, whether it's stormwater based or retail enhancement based. In DC, we have business improvement districts, which are really little coalitions of local businesses, neighborhood businesses. Two of them are investing their own funds in adding trees to their street, and they're working directly with two utilities, DC Water and the DC Urban Forestry Administration.
And we're actually talking with national utility groups about getting more case studies specific to their topic, to their issues on the site. So yeah, that is something that will be more robustly represented on Vibrant Cities Lab. Because there are best practices that have proven to work and practices that have proven disastrous. So really highlighting the things that are working, I think work for everybody better.
The challenge really, the biggest challenge is underground utilities.
Okay. And thanks to the listeners who've been sending questions. Just a reminder that you can continue to send questions to us by using the questions tool on your screen. So the next one we'll ask is specific to the Baltimore Wood project. Can that be expanded to also promote the use of wood energy as an end use for ash trees, whether for residential or commercial energy?
So a big part of any urban wood utilization project is figuring out what those markets are, right? I think a lot of people think of, when you think of urban wood, you think of sort of boutique, small furniture producers. And one of the things we are exploring is what are the markets for that wood? Because when you talk about urban wood waste, you have anything, when you're talking about the fresh cut side of things coming out of urban forestry activities, you're talking about anything from 8-foot lengths of 2-foot DBH trees to tiny little pieces of twig that come off of things. And it's that smaller diameter stuff that you really need to figure out how to use. The things that aren't going to be turned into mulch or into compost, but aren't going to be turned into furniture, right? And so certainly a part of that conversation is, whether or not a combined heat and power system, for example, makes sense in that municipality. I can talk about local heat, and there are certainly communities that are doing that. I believe in Seattle, they're using some of their urban wood waste to feed their combined heat and power system, but I'd have to double check on that before I swear by it. But there are certainly communities that are using their urban wood waste in that way.
Yeah, the upper Midwest, they really took the brunt of EAB or Emerald Ash Borer initially and have some of the most sophisticated and well thought out responses to it at this point. And St. Paul, Minnesota is a good example of that. They have a massive power plant right downtown that processes wood waste, and they have this whole system worked out. Landscapers and storm responders, they dump at a yard, and then it gets turned over into pellets and turned into power. So it's a really high, scaled up example. And
we really talk about with urban wood use, finding each log its highest and best use, right? So would you take an 8-foot length that's a 2-foot DBH oak tree and turn it into mulch? Into mulch or burn it in an incinerator? Hopefully not, right?
No.
And so, one thing we've done in Baltimore is we launched a partnership with a furniture company, Room and Board, who is making furniture from some of the wood coming out of Baltimore. They're calling it the Urban Wood Project Baltimore. If you search for it, you can see a couple of the pieces they've launched. There'll be more launching soon. And so it's really about finding those diversified markets for wood products that allow us to use all of the wood in a meaningful way.
I think brick and board, not room. Okay.
One of the challenges, of course, is educating the local tree care industry to leave the wood in 8-foot lengths as opposed to little chunks of 2-foot DBH red oak, or in one case, I know of black walnut that could have been, if it were an 8-foot length, converted into $10,000 worth of veneer.
Yeah, one of the more exciting parts of urban forestry is reutilizing that wood waste, because it really brings it full circle, and you can really start thinking of managing that landscape that you wouldn't really think of as natural as you would a forest system, anywhere else sustainably. And I don't know, I get excited about the prospects of that.
Well, we're a self-selected group.
Yeah.
People who love trees.
Excellent. So I guess in a related way, someone asked said, I think LEED renovation rewards using materials on site. Could it reward reuse from the urban wood economy?
That's a great question. And there's been some, I believe, it's possible dovetail looked a couple of years ago into the use of wood products in LEED certified buildings. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure how that clicks in yet. I know that there are a number of LEED certified projects who have used urban wood, but I would have to do more research before being able to answer that question in a meaningful way. Looking at my colleagues, I think that's a shared sentiment.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so another question. Is there data that shows the impacts on trees long-term when utility companies apply branch growth inhibitor?
I don't know of any.
Yeah, we're not familiar with any. That's a good question, though.
Okay. Great. Okay, so then to transition a little bit, could the site be expanded to include links to urban tree species descriptions, such as what's available on the Friends of the Urban Forest website? What about expanding the site to go beyond trees to other types of plantings, whether they're rain gardens, community gardens, botanical gardens, and so on?
So part of that is there are a lot of examples like that, like Friends of the Urban Forest in San Francisco. So there was not really a need to replicate that, but linking to them is a priority.
And tagging as location as well, because those lists are going to be specific to the geographies in which they're produced. So we're certainly happy to link to those. And I can't remember if there are any already linked to on the site, but it's certainly something we could do, and we would love to do if folks want to send us what they'd like to see up there. In terms of expanding it, we already quite a bit talk about green space and open space where applicable. I don't think at this point there are plans to expand it to talk specifically about understory species, as Larry just said. But it's really difficult when you really start looking at this research to tease those things apart. Often in cities, there is occasionally research specific to trees, but a lot of what's cited here is also applicable to green space in general. And so to some extent, that's already done on the site.
Gotcha. Okay. So I guess the question maybe covers a little bit of the ground that you talked about earlier, but can you talk about the use of urban trees for lumber, et cetera? Are these primarily from parks?
That's a great question. They come from a ton of different places. So they come from right-of-ways where you have urban forestry activities happening either by utility companies or with things like storm damage, or when you have things like the emerald ash borer coming in and you have 200,000 trees that are going to need to come down pretty quickly as a safety hazard. And that really highlights why it's so important to have a planning aspect to this and not just be reactive, which is, as my colleagues were saying, part of what we're aiming at with this site. It is, if you already have the expectation in place that contractors in the city cut urban trees to 8-foot lengths, then you're ready to use those trees for their highest and best use. If they get cut into 6-inch cookies, it really changes the future for those trees.
Cookies are just a cross-section of the tree. Like,
sorry, forestry speak. But I mean, I think that they're coming from right-of-ways. They can come from private property, although often where those trees go is slightly different. For example, in Baltimore, they have a sort yard called Camp Small, where anything coming off of public property is brought to Camp Small and processed. And so that's coming from parks, it's coming from municipal buildings where things are going wrong, government-owned buildings. In Baltimore, there's vacant property that the city has taken possession of, and it can come from there. And then your standard urban forest, the tree in that 2-foot wide swath between your sidewalk and your road.
Okay. Someone asked a general question about talking about, I guess, making existing uses and businesses more compatible, I would say, with urban forests. Are there some best practices in this area that we can hone in on?
I guess we need a little bit of clarity on the question. If you're talking about existing businesses, are you speaking specifically about businesses that are influencing the tree canopy, or are you talking about businesses that might be owners of that tree canopy?
Yeah, I think we're talking about existing businesses that are already there and making whatever they can do to be more compatible with the urban tree canopy. I mean, are there? It sounds like there's a lot of research and information available in there. But is there any specific things you could direct us to?
Yeah, I would encourage them to look at some of the policies that have been adopted to influence the planting of trees on private business property. The ones that sort of smack me in the forehead tend to do with stormwater management. That is a major challenge for most communities. And particularly if you can create a policy that offers incentives to business rather than simply imposes costs on business, you can be successful. There are a number of case studies in the trees and stormwater site that examine this directly, and I think a few of them are already on the Vibrant Cities Lab. Chicago in particular has a pretty aggressive policy aimed at creating those kinds of incentives for existing business owners, especially if they're property owners.
And I would encourage you to go to the resource library and search private lands. Cracking the nut of how to care for the urban forest that is not on our public lands but is in our private lands is a really tough one, because you have to influence the behavior of thousands upon thousands of landowners. And so there are quite a few researchers who are doing work in this field, and some really interesting work from some of our nonprofit partners in terms of how to inventory, monitor, and encourage both planting and maintenance of trees on private lands.
And Larry mentions earlier, but private lands oftentimes account for 80% of a city's tree canopy or metro area's tree canopy.
It's doable. It's doable. It's challenging but doable. A lot of it depends on political will. And political will is a function of the case that you can make about the multiple values of trees. There's a county executive in Kentucky who recently said that publicly that the trees in his community were the hardest working civil servants that he had. They don't cost much to maintain, and they deliver a lot of benefits to my residents, and they don't take lunch breaks.
Yeah, back to an earlier question, yeah, really getting city leaders to think in terms of infrastructure and, trees being part of that. Oftentimes, even trees are excluded from green infrastructure talk. Really making that connection for people who might not care about the more ambiguous benefits.
And I'll mention, just as a little plug for iTree, that the iTree tools, you can find it at itreetools.org, many of them will monetize the benefits that you get from individual trees. There's a MyTree app that will give you sort of a nutrition label for your individual tree. And then there are tools on iTree as well that will monetize your urban tree canopy as a whole. And so if you are speaking to someone that you think would understand dollar terms best, we certainly have the tools available to help you do that.
Great. Okay. So we just have a couple last questions here before we conclude. What has been the reaction of traffic engineers and state highway administrators toward tree-lined streets? In Florida, most traffic engineers did not want trees within the right-of-way because of safety concerns, because it causes obstructions.
So the tide, that has been for a long time, the response that we've heard is that there are safety concerns associated with trees. There are two things I'll point to, and then I'll let Ian and Larry, who are a bit more familiar with the transportation section, speak about it. But one, trees are an excellent traffic calming measure. And so used correctly, they can actually be something that slows traffic and decreases the number of accidents occurring on roads, especially in cities. And the second thing I'll mention is that trees can actually increase the longevity of asphalt. And so by shading the asphalt from direct sunlight, they can increase the amount of time that cities can go between needing to repave roads. And so while we have seen historically a lot of concern about the safety of trees, I think some of the newest science is starting to shift some of that thinking.
Yeah, the trend in many cities toward increased bicycle use and increased pedestrian traffic has led more and more traffic engineers, transportation engineers, to think about complete streets, that is, streets that can accommodate all users, not just automobiles. And alongside that, there has emerged a companion initiative called Green Streets. And these are coming together precisely for the reason that Lauren mentioned. If you have multiple different kinds of users on a street, you want to do all that you can to modulate automobile traffic. And trees do that. Traffic engineers in our county are very much into trees as a traffic calming device.
Yeah, a lot of cities are really trying to make that transition to multimodality. Tempe, Arizona is a good example of that. They have a 2040 plan to really transition, but also grow as a city and be able to handle the growth they're expecting. So when you're talking to a transportation engineer, really leading with that, like, again, at the core of this site, trees aren't the only answer, but they are a contributing factor in helping you reach those goals, whether it's increasing walkability or bikeability. There's a stat on the site that children are walking 38% less than they did a generation ago to school. So really, just finding what they're interested in, what their end objective is, and then drawing that line for them from that to tree canopy.
And I'll just mention, I believe it's out of Oregon right now, there's some interesting legislation about potentially intentionally growing trees in urban areas for later use as lumber. And part of that, if I'm not mistaken, does include some plantings in right-of-ways along roadways that are owned by the public. And so there's some interesting movement on that in the Pacific Northwest at least.
Well, you probably have gathered by now that in some cases, many cases, we are working against conventional wisdom. And that is part of the aim of the site, is to challenge conventional wisdom, which is, I think, still, hopefully not for long. Trees are pretty, but we want it to be trees are pretty and that really is what we hope the message will be that you take away from this session.
Excellent. Well, that's a good concluding thought there, Larry. I guess one last question, because we did get a couple of these. If you all could just talk about how often the site's going to be updated to keep it current, and whether folks should keep an eye out pretty often to see when new information will be put online?
So right now, the answer is sort of continuously, but as we put in place this very transparent, very consistent process for vetting new content, I suspect you'll see a quarterly update. And we've had some conversations about having a newsletter that could go out to folks with those quarterly updates as well. And so we'll continue to talk about that so folks can stay abreast.
Yeah, let me encourage you to register an account on the site with your email. And at the very least, we're going to try to notify registered users of changes to the site just by email.
Great. Well, with that, I think we'll go ahead and end our webinar today. Thank you very much, Larry, Lauren, and Ian, for a very interesting hour-and-a-half discussion. This concludes our webinar, Teaming Up for Urban Forestry, New Tools to Build and Energize Local Sustainability Efforts. I want to give a big thank you to our presenters for the information they provided and to all who attended today. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org later this week. You will be able to find it in our webinar archives. When you exit from today's webinar, you will be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we may continue to improve our webinar programming. And keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and our weekly e-newsletter for details on future webinars. Thank you very much.